All right, welcome back, y'all. This is going to be section 1C, protection of the press. So we're going to talk about two cases. The first is Brandsburg v. Hayes in 1972. The second is Zurcher v. Stanford Daily in 1978. So, first, Brandsburg v. Hayes, 1972. Excuse me. The ruling, the Supreme Court rules 5-4, a very close decision, and affirms the lower court ruling. The majority is written by Justice White, and the dissent is written by Justice Stewart. So the question at hand, does requiring journalists to testify before state and federal grand juries abridge a journalist's First Amendment rights to free speech and um, protection of their sort of anonymous tipsters or that sort of thing? And the court says no. Um, that a journalist must attend and testify at a federal grand jury. So there are three cases to give you some context here. First, in Louisville, Kentucky, there were some journalists reporting on the creation of hashish and the drug scene, as they quote, in Louisville, Kentucky, and they were asked to report to a grand jury. The second, in Providence, Rhode Island, a journalist entered a Black Panther meeting waiting for a police raid that never occurred. And he never actually published anything, but he was still asked to testify. And then third, a New York Times Black Panther journalist in North California was also asked to testify to a grand jury. And the journalists all claim that in order to operate effectively, they need to be able to guarantee anonymity. But the court says the only protection that they have is the Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. Because journalists are ordinary citizens like anyone else, they do not have protection against testifying before a grand jury. The dissent, the first dissent, says that the majority went way too far and that journalists should not be obligated to testify to grand juries under the First Amendment because they should be a special class of citizens, basically. And the second dissent says, quote, the court thus invites state and federal authorities to annex the journalistic profession as an investigative arm of government. Not only will this decision impair performance of the press's constitutionally protected functions, but will, in the long run, harm rather than help the administration of justice. So basically, they're saying that the executive branch and the judicial branch are now using, because of this ruling, will now use journalists as cops, basically, and constantly subpoena journalists to try and get their anonymous sources and information. Okay, case 2, Zurcher v. Stanford Daily in 1978. Interesting case. The court reverses the lower court ruling in a 5-3 decision. Justice White provides the majority opinion and Justice Stevens dissents. So, what is the context here? First, a Stanford University photographer is on the scene when protesters attacked police officers, and I think it said 9 police officers were injured at a protest on Stanford's campus in which students were involved. And a photographer was on the scene and purportedly took photos of the attackers. They did not publish the photos of the attackers, they just showed sort of the mob, right? Santa Clara, where Stanford is located, Santa Clara's district attorney's office raids the newspaper looking for photos of the incident to try and find out who assaulted the officers. A judge issues a warrant for it, so it's all sort of up to date. Basically, it's all by the book. Stanford sues the police and the attorney and the judge for unlawful search and seizure. under the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments. And the question here is basically focused on the Fourth Amendment. And they say the Fourth Amendment is the most fruitful sort of approach. Do the authorities have the right to search and seizure, even though the owners of the property in question did not actually commit the crime? And the court claims that, that's bullshit. There's no difference. That Stanford claims that the state has less right to be involved when the owner of the evidence in question has no involvement with the crime in question, right? The photographer didn't commit the crime. He just took photos. And they're saying, well, since the photographer didn't commit the crime, the state doesn't have a right to search and seizure. You can only have search and seizure against whoever committed the act. The court disagrees wholeheartedly and says basically the state has a right to that location and that evidence regardless of the status of the owner, whether they're the criminal or not. And they say that, the whole idea behind Stanford's argument is really problematic, right? Because, first of all, sometimes you don't know if the owner of the item committed the crime or not, right? Like, it's not always obvious who committed the crime, and you won't be able to tell until you get the evidence. And so if you put this limit on the police to be able to put their hands on the evidence, then, potentially the person who did commit the crime, who the police don't know, is going to get rid of it, or is a friend of the person who committed the crime and will help collude with them to get rid of it, etc. So they say this whole idea is silly. The state has a right to collect the evidence regardless of the status of the owner of the evidence. Okay, that's it for this section. I'll see you for the next one, which will be Unit 1D, Access to the Criminal Justice Process.